This is LBC News.
Let's get some more reaction to what we heard in the King's speech today. Effectively, a big long list of what the government is planning to do over the course of the parliamentary session that's just getting underway. We know that there are two draft pieces of legislation coming down the track regarding housing, a draft Leasehold and Commonhold Reform bill and a renters' rights bill as well, which would include a ban on so-called no-fault evictions. Let's speak to Harry Scoffin, who is founder of the campaign group Free Leaseholders and is joining us here on LBC News. Thank you for your time this afternoon. We've heard lots about the plight of renters, haven't we, over the course of the past few years, and Conservative governments of the last few years have promised to take action in this area. I don't think much has come of it thus far, has there? Are you hopeful that more will now happen?
Absolutely, and I think with the Renters Reform Bill, so much of it has already been done. Obviously, it famously didn't make the pre-election wash-up, and actually it's a good thing that it didn't, because there were loads of compromises that were foisted on that piece of legislation at the last minute by Conservative backbenchers that wanted to water it all down. So it's actually a lot better for Labour to do it properly this time in this King's speech. But, you know, I'm here to talk about leasehold reform in particular, because that is another huge injustice. We're talking about 5.3 million households who've bought homes and then they find themselves trapped in this sort of feudal regime and they've not got control over their running costs, even though they've paid a premium to own and control it. And we're literally the last countries left in the world, England and Wales, where we have this situation where you buy a tenancy and you're basically like a mortgage renter. So that's also great news that there is going to be a draft legislation coming through on that. And again, like the Renters Reform Bill, it always was competing for attention with the last Conservative government. Labour are going to finish the job and do it properly.
And what do you exactly want to see then with regards to reform of leasehold?
Ultimately, the Labour manifesto commitment's really clear that they're going to ban new leasehold flats, but finally bring an end to the feudal leasehold system. Those are their words. Obviously, we've had successive governments promising that and then not delivering. But I think the political opportunity structure is there now to get to do it, basically, because after Grenfell, when the whole situation of cladding and building safety charges came through, this role of this shadowy freeholder that they say they're the building owner and then pay diddly squat for making these buildings safe, there was a whole debate that was thrown up about, actually, do we need freeholders? Can't the residents be the building owners themselves? And that's where there's this big push now for Commonhold. And briefly, that basically means freehold for flats. So you own your flat outright, you'll own a share in the common parts, and then you and your neighbours have a form of democratic self-rule. You'll appoint the managing agent, and that managing agent will work for you, not some grubby rent-seeking offshore company in Monaco or the Cayman Islands who is there just to extract as much income out of the service charges and buildings insurance and all the other income streams as possible. So that's a huge move. And obviously there is that draft legislation. And I think it's refreshing from the last government where they were trying to railroad this legislation through. And there wasn't a sense that they really wanted to open up to consultation and to bring in leaseholders and their advocates to make sure that the legislation is the best it can be. Labour have obviously cleverly realised they want to have the space to make sure that this really is the final bit of legislation on leasehold that any UK government will have to pass.
It all sounds like, it's going to be lovely. And you mentioned about how you'll have this Commonhold system and that those people will own their flats outright. They'll have a share of the common areas. I mean, what comes when we get to a situation where, like, a block of flats gets near the end of its life and it needs to be replaced? What would happen in a situation then?
Yeah, so there'll need to be mechanisms about basically redevelopment, and that's where we can look at New South Wales, Australia, who basically pioneered Commonhold. They called it strata title. They introduced that in the 60s. Singapore as well, where you look at basically bringing those mechanisms. But the good news is a lot of the work on this has already been done by the Law Commission. Back in 2020, they handed over this huge report on reviving Commonhold, and there are policies in there that would actually help when it comes to a building being the end of its life. But I think the key thing is that the people that have got skin in the game, that actually own their flats and pay for the upkeep, will have control. And I think the key thing is, yes, there may be tensions, residents, there may be tensions, but at the end of the day, you've got that alignment of interest because you want to make sure that the capital value of your flat goes up. And that means maintaining it to a good standard, investing in the building so it doesn't fall to rack and ruin. And we saw that in the fallout from the Grenfell Tower tragedy. In the good times, they say we control everything, we are the noble custodians. Soon as they have to put their hands in their pockets, they scarpered. So I think that Commonhold situation, it's a bit like Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst system except all others that have been tried. Commonhold is democracy. Leasehold is like a form of monocracy or like rule by one person, and it just doesn't work. So I think moving to that Commonhold system is what people are crying out for. And given the Tories shortchanged us so badly at the last minute, because I understand there were going to be Commonhold fixes to get it going in the bill that was going to happen, and then that election was called and those amendments didn't pass. So I think it's a really exciting time. And also, this isn't about just people that already have leasehold properties. Anyone that wants to see a decisive end to the housing crisis needs to be behind this agenda, because there's no point building 1.5 million new homes if there are these leasehold debt-trapped tenancies. People's lives are being ruined. The idea that service charges can just skyrocket and you've got no control or say over that. And even Hamptons, you know, these guys, naturally, they're estate agents. They want to talk up the flats market. Last year, they glumly came out and said leaseholders in England's flats are paying a staggering £7.6 billion in service charge. Think of what we could do if some of that money redirected into the productive economy. You know, starting a business, starting a family. There's a lot of money that's going into kickbacks and commissions for freeholders and managing agents. So bringing those managing agents in particular under residents that are paying the bills, they are finally the service providers, I think is a fantastic pro-growth policy. And Labour's made it clear in the manifesto, and they've put it in the King speech briefing notes, that basically ending leasehold is helping to end one of the barriers to opportunity, because famously leasehold comes from serfdom and the idea of master and serf and, you know, landlord and tenant. It's a hugely privileged regime that keeps the very elite very wealthy. And I think that's why we've not really had radical change in this area for generations, even though successive governments have promised to get rid of it.
Michael Gove was the housing secretary, wasn't he, in the last government? And he talked a lot about leasehold and plans to get rid of it. What do you make of his record in this area?
Well, I think the thing is, he was coming from a position where this issue was not that salient, and he had to try and get the whole Conservative Party behind it. And, you know, the fact is that the last time any government legislated on leasehold was in 2002, the heyday of the Blair government. He was trying to get the whole Conservative, that whole machine, behind this agenda. And actually, it's ironic, because the word Commonhold came from the Conservative Party. There was an MP called Sir Brandon Rees-Williams. Margaret Thatcher, on the last day she was Prime Minister, brought forward a Commonhold bill, a draft bill, was never delivered. John Major brought in a draft bill in 1996. That also wasn't delivered. It was left to Labour to introduce it in 2002. And you know what? I was 1 year old in 1995. Labour promised an end to feudalism then under the late Frank Dobson and Nick Rainsford. They got into power. They brought in Commonhold after years of Tory dither and delay, but they didn't mandate it. I think that's the key differentiator this time. They're saying all new flats have to be Commonhold, and then they're going to unshackle those of us already in the current regime. But I think with Gove, he made a valiant effort to get the Conservatives behind this. Ultimately, number 10, I don't think they did buy into the agenda, sadly, and that's why we got the limited bill that we got in the wash-up. But it's now the Labour to basically finish the job. And the good news as well is that Labour are now committing to bringing into force the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024, which is still a historic intervention. It's going to make it easier and cheaper for leaseholders to extend their leases, to buy their freeholds. And for those like my mum, for example, who couldn't qualify to get the right to manage because they've got some commercial premises underneath, like a shop or a hotel, they'll now be able to claim democratic self-rule. So there are some good things in that bill, and Labour, you know, very brilliantly are now saying they're going to bring it into force, because the last Conservative government said we'd have to wait another 2 years before those provisions came into play. So that's great. And I think there is that element of, this is unfinished business for the Conservatives as well. They're talking about trying to be an effective parliamentary opposition. They should be getting their teeth into this agenda. You know, Kemi Badenoch now is the housing spokesperson. A young Mrs. Thatcher was the Conservative spokesperson for housing in the late 1960s off the back of the 66 general election. She was breathing down the throat of the Harold Wilson government saying, when are you going to enfranchise leaseholders? When are you going to bring forward the bills? So there's an agenda there for the Conservatives. And I think the key point is that beyond what Labour put in their manifesto, nearly 84% of the electorate voted for political parties at this last general election that put taking action against leasehold in the manifesto. So that was Labour, that was the Conservatives, it's also the Liberal Democrats and Reform UK. I mean, what sort of consensus can you get on any other policy issues? So it's a quick win for Labour, really, and they'll go down. It will be historic. If they do this right, there are no loopholes in legislation, because leasehold reform legislation is famous for it. If they do it properly, and I think that's why the draft legislation is so important, to get everyone in there, ensure that stakeholders are heard, and that we make sure that this legislation is the best it possibly can be. They will free 5.3 million households and make sure that my generation, I'm 29, I live at home, with my family, and the fact is, a boomerang generation, if we're, spending our lives at home or renting, we don't want to be glorified rental tenants with a load of mortgage debt and service charge debt. We want to be in control. So I think this is a huge growth policy, and I think also it's got the buy-in of Angela Rayner, which is really key, and also Matthew Pennycook, that's been on the housing beat for years and was really forensic with his scrutiny of the Tory LAFRA bill, or LAFRA Act, that's just passed. So I think it's really looking good.
OK, well, thank you very much for joining us. We wait to see exactly what happens when the government brings forward these pieces of legislation. Harry Scoffin there, founder of the campaign group Free Leaseholders.